just to sort of level set for for those of us who may be coming from the outside, if you've got process automation, you get it. If you don't, then it's a bit of an amorphous term, and it might be difficult to visualize just exactly what it is that we're talking about and the kinds of benefits that it can bring to an enterprise. Can one of you guys give us a sort of a concrete example of the sorts of problems that we're talking about and the effect of solving those problems with automation?
Yeah, I can give one example. I think there's lots of different categories of when you're talking about process automation. I think one of the biggest challenges for venture capital, for example, is you have a bunch of investments, you have a bunch of portfolio companies, very non-standard data, balance sheets, et cetera, and you're trying to compile all of that with a very lean firm and share that with investors. So just setting up data collection, automated emails that go out, Excels that are familiar to the users, but then can auto ingest into a database and be present on a website and download into tear sheets and valuations and all the different things that you need to do. So learning all those tools to kind of suck data in and put it back into something that's familiar and usable by the business. That's one example. And then one other kind of thing that was a big part of my early career when I was at the bank and anti-money laundering was, and this was like right when I was really trying to figure out what my career was really going to look like. I was in my MBA on the side at the time, and I was learning all these buzzwords like throughput rate, but I didn't really know how to, I was in analytics and I was like, okay, I'm learning all this business stuff. How do I apply this and get the attention of like the chief compliance officer and actually have impact on the department that I was working in? And my team was so focused on the analytics, the models, how do you use statistical software to figure out what's an anomalous transaction in money laundering and therefore, have a defensible, okay, well, we investigated that. So, we were trying at least. I looked at it from a totally different angle. I said, okay, we've got 100 people in this department. 60 of them are investigators. And they're processing 2,000 alerts in a month. And so, how can I accelerate those investigations and therefore, save the cost or the bottom line of, our speed. And so that's where I saw a low-hanging fruit of like, I wasn't a miracle coder, but I knew how to use a business intelligence tool called Tableau. And, you can basically really quickly create your own user interface. And I realized that, I have access to all the data that the investigators need, and they're going to like 15 different websites to get all this data to do an investigation. And so it takes a long time just logging in, if you just think of the keystrokes or the mouse clicks. And so I was like, I could bring it all into one pane. So when they go to investigate a guy, it just pops up and they can see everything that they need. So.
That's interesting. I think you hit on a couple. Tim hit on one thing, this whole 80-20 thing. Like if we can just, 80% of every chunk's pretty easy to do, and the last 20% is hard. But if we can isolate that last 20%, it turns into exception handling. And I think, Kevin, what I sort of heard out of you is, we're processing 2,000 investigations a month or whatever the number is, but I don't know, 1,600 of them were probably vanilla, maybe, and the remaining 400 are much more complicated. And I think automation helps you isolate those 400. And then once you've done that, right, now you can look at 80% of those 400 probably have some commonality. And then you're working in these 80% chunks in a way. But I think that's really interesting because when you're doing like anti-money laundering or something like that, and you have well-defined rules for what constitutes a problem, the problem can be relatively simple to solve with automation, right? We all know the rules. We can, different tools can help you, Tableau or Excel or anything can help you implement those things in ways that it may or may not be maintainable. And that can be a rapid job. But when you have a process that's broken, introducing automation starts with, I think, what Tim does. Right. The hardest customers for us to work with are the ones that don't know their own process. Right. Because Tim, I don't know, have you seen cases where they automated something that just wasn't well designed to begin with? And then what was the first thing you had to do?
Oh man, I can't think of any example of that necessarily, but I can tell you that
I can.
when I think about trying to automate something that doesn't work, I can't even think through like how you get through the meeting around it, because people are like, well, that's not going to work. That's when it's finally going to vet out that this thing doesn't work.
Welcome to my world. Yeah.
So John needs Tim, not
No, I got
the venture capital example is interesting too, because that's a very unusual investment. You can't, there's probably not stuff sitting on the shelf that allows you to do that, since that's a more specialized thing. So have you had to create tools? It sounds like you've had to create tools to deal with that.
There is a tool that's on the shelf, and it's one of those things where they get you, the vendor gets you because they're like, oh, look, it works with Excel. It's familiar. You can do it too. You don't need to know how to code. And then you get into all the nuances, and it's so complicated. It's called iLevel. It's really cool what the software can do. Basically anyone can create Excel models and, run these like write statements that write it up into the cloud and get it back into the Excel. And then at the same time, you can have a website that's modeled right after your Excel and kind of see it right as you're doing that. It's just, these firms, I think they buy it, and they first have like the investment banker try to set it up, and they just have zero interest in like understanding the technical consequences of their actions. And they don't realize that it's a complex system, even though not necessarily looking at the code. And so that's where I've found my recent career. And, it started at TCV. I was investor relations. So I was kind of doing the tech, but kind of working with investors. And then PIMCO, reached out and they needed to re-implement their iLevel system. So that's what pulled me over there.
Oh, really? So you got pulled over because of
about,
a specific system you had expertise in.
If you're interested.
Yeah, there's not a lot of people that know it. So it's kind of easy to find jobs right now in that tool.
If you're interested in a
Sometimes
tool,
About a new tool. I'm sorry, go ahead.
A very good tool to consider is Scrum, which was written by Sutherland, who's a West Point grad. And Jira is a particularly good implementation of this. And what it lets you do is pull teams together and quickly throw things up onto a bulletin board. You come up with the story, you define what tasks need to be done, and you break it into it is a very nice processing way of doing this. Yeah, heavily used by software development teams. Yeah, but also
Jira is a good example too. I mean, with Jira, you have an excellent tool, but it requires a certain discipline behind the tool.
Sure.
The agile framework and agile practices, in order really to get the full benefit of what the tool can do with respect to task management and that kind of thing. Otherwise you've just got a more efficient way of running your completely your completely broken process.
Sure. But it brings in all of the Six Sigma just-in-time tools that we did with manufacturing back in when you guys were still children. In the 80s, when we went from mass production to just-in-time manufacturing. And that disciplined way of looking at processes and pulling your teams in so that, and this goes back to what Tim says, is getting out on the floor and working with people and pulling the teams together and developing the finesse within the art of the process before you automate it.
I'm breaking guys really quickly here. So I'm a
Sandra?
And so, yes, I work for tech company. In fact, I work for Atlassian, who's the owner of Jira and Confluence and HipChat, and they also now own Trello. They were buying Trello as I was leaving Atlassian. So I have to agree with, I don't know who said this, but if you get junk in, you're going to have junk come out the other end. So you have to start with your process first. You cannot start and say that any tool you get, I can pretty much, as a Six Sigma black belt and operational excellence person, can take any task, any tool into a company and watch them break it. Because if you're not using it and you don't have good data coming into it, you're going to have bad data coming out of it. If you don't know your process, your process will not work. So a tool, we've always taught that a tool will not fix any process problems you have. You have to go back and fix your process first. If you're not communicating, Trello, Jira, you can go out and I can name Basecamp. I can name about 50 different tools. None of them will work. So your process has to be defined first. And I think it was Tim that said something about, I think, Tim, you sound like you were an Amazon guy, because I used to work for Amazon as well. And you use some of the leadership principles that we had to learn on day one. But at the end of the day, yes, you have to have a good process before you can begin using any tools. And that's what Atlassian hired me to teach those guys, because they were using, they had a great system, and some of the guys got it right. Some teams got it right and some teams didn't.
I mean, if you put noise in an amplifier, what do you get out? Just more noise, a lot of noise, I guess, And so, John, I'm curious, man, you're an aspirational automator, I guess. Yeah. Or skeptic, but like, what are some examples of processes that exist, right? Where you're like, man, this is just harder than it ought to be.
Yeah, we have plenty of them, right? So I'll give you like two specifics. Well, there's one group of them. Think of the accounts receivable, accounts payable, managing the cash. Yeah, business like us, we're constantly getting invoiced, paying. We're invoicing, shipping products, invoicing and collecting, all that kind of stuff, right? And our systems are antiquated. That's the best thing I can say about them. They're like 12 years plus since they've had any kind of upgrades. They're really not very functional. And our organization is fairly lean and half pregnant in terms of centralization, decentralization. So fundamentally, I got to do something to clean up the systems. And I've got to change the org structure and either completely decentralize or centralize. But the half and half model kind of sucks. And, we've got a culture, we're real high tech here. We're making wooden plates. We got a lot of people who've been in this company only for, the average tenure on my teams is over 20 years, just to put a fine point on it. Right. So, and that's fine. They're good people. They're good hard workers and everything, but they haven't been exposed to anything outside this company. So, it's a pretty, even not just the convincing part, but just literally the driving of the change. Yeah. These are folks that have not had to change in over 20 years, and there's so many different things that would need to change. And our processes are terrible. They function, right? Thank God, but they're just very labor intensive. And CFOs sleep better at night when they're good. But, just like I won't bore you with the 37 steps to invoice a customer and get cash, but, it's terrible. The other one is, and if you ever meet my CEO, don't tell him I said this, but, he loves his 240-page monthly reporting deck. It is a terrible, terrible waste of time and energy of my teams. Collectively, I added up all the math, and I have approximately 2 full-time equivalents across my teams. I've got about 20 people. So 1/10 of my entire workforce does nothing but generate this one report that feeds a 3-hour meeting where no real important decisions get made. And it's atrocious. And, I've looked at, and there are systems that could automate all that. However, the garbage in, garbage out principle prevails. And most of the time and energy my teams have to spend is, you can pull a report, but it's wrong. Why is it wrong?
Yep.
It's a myriad of reasons, and every single, action in there, you've got to do what our systems enable us, but then you have to have that secret, special, years-long knowledge of, well, if I see this, I need to ignore it. If I see this, I need to go to this spreadsheet and, link into there and go fix this. And then when I move this to this tool, then I have to click this flag on in Excel so that when I run the subsequent query, it doesn't blow up. And I mean, it's that terrible. So I've looked at, with a partner that could do that. There's an outfit called Workiva, for example, where they're really great at reproducing standard reporting over and over and over again. But I just asked them, I said, you've got to show me how you can take the garbage that we're working with here and turn it into that sweet, sweet stuff. And they couldn't do it, right? I mean, they kind of looked at it and finally had to kind of come back to us and said, well, there's two projects. One is us and implementing us, but you've got to do something about that whole data mess.
That's right.
It's like, well, okay. So these are the kind of barriers that somebody like me who would desperately love to, and I'm totally bought into, some of the great benefits of automation. It's smaller scale. It's easier to do if you have the right building blocks. It's smaller in scope. It's usually cheaper than some of the other, I've been in 4 SAP implementations, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the failed. And the only thing they had in common was they're incredibly painful and terrible and awful, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. So I'm thrilled with the prospect that there are smaller bite-sized pieces of software that can help, finance teams and business teams and decision makers. But yeah, it's not as easy as just go pick the tool and it just kind of implements itself. It's a lot more complex.
No, it never implements itself, right? Even off the shelf stuff doesn't implement itself. It's amazing.
Which that, by the way,
Jason,
I'm hopeful that in the future, that's I think where the next evolution will come, right? It's got to turn into where you don't just have the sexy tool with the sexy coding and you all, got together in a coffee shop and made something cool. You've got to solve the problem of how do you do automation of the messy part of implementing onto a vast array of tools and processes, and that'll be the winning ticket once we figure that out, how to do that better.
So Jason, I bet you've never seen an implementation go bad.
Sorry. Oh Lord, seen several, and I'll tell you that there is one particular point where the failure, it's the breaking point where failure seems to happen over and over, and that happens when you try to scale, right? So here's a common example. I got a sales process, right? So there's a flow chart, you send certain emails at certain times and you make the calls, and right, there's scripts, and it's a process that a single salesperson uses to process a single lead from lead to prospect to the close, right? Works great. So what happens now when you've got 20 salespeople, each prosecuting a dozen different leads, each one at a different place in the same process, right? Suddenly, you have to maintain state. You have to know, who's at which part of what process and when, right? And that is a highly non-trivial problem that cannot be solved off the shelf with any tool. I've never seen a tool that just does that, right? They all require some level of taking that flow chart and getting it into the automation in such a fashion that it actually works, right? With the exact same problem here at Ringknocker, right? Like our weekly cycle is a flow chart, right? And we try to run 5 or 6 weekly cycles at once, where we're at different parts of the process, and obviously, we're doing the meetup now, but we're like working on next week's, and we're processing last week's, and so on, right? And so just maintaining state on that, where there's only one a week, is a challenge. By the way, we use Jira for that, Jira with Jira automation. But now multiply that by 100, for like an organization like yours, Chris, that's got a complex sales process for a big product for industrial scale clients. I mean, not trivial.
We're an automation company, and that the one you just described is the one I live every day right now. I mean, I spend an ungodly amount of time trying to figure out, are my leads covered? Because guess what? You spend for a given lead, we're spending $200,000 a month just to generate leads, right? And so these things are valuable. And here we are, an automation company, but the reality is, we're trying to use off-the-shelf tools to we don't use our own stuff for that, just because there is off-the-shelf stuff. But it turns out, as you try to customize that off-the-shelf stuff, it can get really, really difficult ultimately. And I think that's a dilemma we all face.
That's the value proposition, right? Because, without the right stuff, you've got, 2 or 3 full-time employees, who are hacking spreadsheets and spreading flop sweat all over the place just to keep track of who's where in which process and who they belong to, right? You add the right automation on top of that, and all of a sudden you need, 1 part-time person to just to kind of, keep the thing running, and it just works, right? Now,
and if they die, you can replace them.
You can replace them. Guess what? Because there's a process for that, right? It's all written down. You can literally take a new person, plug them into the same process, say, go look at this web page, and here are the instructions for how to run the stuff that this box represents. That's connected by arrows to all the other boxes. And guess what? When the process changes, you just update the instructions and you're off and running again, right? So that's the way it's supposed to look. Getting there is not trivial.